Welcome, everybody. I'm Laura Thomas, and I want to welcome you to our third episode of Teaching Unpacked, Stories from the Classroom. Today, we are going to be joined by Bill Vinton, who will introduce a little bit more here in a minute. Before we start, I want to take a moment to thank Peter and Molly Eppig, who provided the generous support for this series and who have always been such wonderful supporters of the work at Antioch. I also want to thank Harold Hale, Peg Smeltz, and Shelley Biles, who have all been so helpful in getting the word out about this series and in supporting the registration process and all the technical stuff that happens behind the scenes. So first, let's introduce ourselves. Tom, do you want to go ahead and go first?
Yeah, hello, Laura and everybody. Tom Julius here. I'm a faculty member at Antioch University, New England, but my career in early elementary education started as a kindergarten teacher and then taught second grade and spent most of my years as a third grade teacher.
Great. I'm Laura Thomas. I'm the director of the Experienced Educators program at Antioch, and also am the outgoing director of the Center for School Renewal. This is my 19th year at Antioch. And before I came, I taught high school speech, theater, English, and debate for about 10 years. And I'm currently also a library media specialist in a little tiny elementary school out in Harrisville, New Hampshire, and I am also a community facilitator and contributing editor for Edutopia. So a couple of housekeeping things before we get going. Just so everyone is aware, this webinar is being recorded, including all of the chat and the question and answer transcript, and they'll be available to download on our YouTube channel, which is Critical Skills 1. There's a link there for a resources page. I'll also drop that into the chat at the end of the webcast, and you'll receive an email that has that link in it too. Please, just a technical thing, if you can use the Q&A feature for questions and use the chat for technical issues. Harold is monitoring that for people who are having trouble, any kind of technical issues that they do. And last, of course, all of these materials are the intellectual property of Antioch and Bill Vinton. So you're welcome to use anything that you learn. Just please, keep names attached and citations and all that good stuff. So I think that's all the housekeeping. The way our agenda will go, as always, here in a minute, we'll turn it over to Bill, and Bill will tell us a story, and then we'll talk about it through the lens of the Critical Skills Classroom. We'll have some opportunity for question and answer and discussion as well. So Tom, you want to introduce Bill?
So Bill Vinton has been and continues to be an important mentor of teachers in the critical skills community for almost 30 years. I have personally visited in Bill's classroom, and what you will see and hear about today is really how his students operate, for real. In Bill's characteristically humble way, he will downplay his accomplishments, but I've always thought of Bill as a modern version of the Renaissance thinker and doer. Academic dean, high school physics teacher, theater director, astronomer, and volunteer firefighter. He draws on all those experiences to inform his work in the classroom. As an early elementary teacher myself, I learn something from Bill every time we talk. So Bill Vinton, welcome to Teaching Unpacked. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you, Tom. And thank you, Laura, for this opportunity. So I'd like to start off with this little Calvin and Hobbes. Boy, I miss Calvin and Hobbes, but he still has so many lessons to teach to us off. And you can see here that I'm sure Mom has talked to Calvin a million times about having more common sense, might have used the word responsibility, which is a favorite word of parents everywhere and teachers everywhere. And as you can see, Calvin claims he has it, just doesn't want to use it. Um, and that seems to be kind of like part of the main theme that I think we're kind of going to address today. I'd like to just start with a little story to show how this plays itself out in classrooms. A few years back, and maybe more years than I care to admit, I had the opportunity to work with a local fourth grade school, and I was basically working with them to put on a musical version of The Hobbit. And there were about 40 people in the cast, and I was often the only adult in the room, which led for some kind of interesting experiences every now and then. But we had a great time doing this. We really, really did, and the show came off wonderfully. But we would regularly, at the end of a rehearsal, sit down and talk about how things went. We debrief the day. So one day I did this, and I asked the question, well, what did we do well today? And one of the students thought for a little bit, and she raised her hand and she said, well, we cooperated really well today. And I said, there were a lot of things that you could point to today that really showed that you were cooperating. Then I moved on and basically said, well, what could we do better tomorrow? And they thought a little bit and they said, well, we could cooperate better. And then I said, well, that's very true. Maybe we could. How could we actually do that? And another student piped up and said, by cooperating. So it's pretty clear that this bunch of students, I think probably maybe all students, have heard that word cooperation 3 zillion times. But that's about all they've heard. They heard that word, they knew it was important, but they never really had much of an opportunity to go much beyond that big word, except that they knew it was important and that they should do it. So what I'm going to be looking at today is a little bit, in a very brief form, about how it is that we can actually get students to actually identify what it means to do things like cooperate, and to articulate some of the things that they can actually do differently to help them become better cooperators in this sense. I'd like to talk about another story, actually. A couple of days ago, we had a faculty meeting, and we were, of course, everybody is debriefing all of this online learning experience that we've all been going through. And one of my colleagues, who's a wonderful, caring teacher with many years of experience, said, well, regardless of whether we go online or not in the fall, we've got to really get the students to realize that they must be responsible for themselves, to be responsible for checking in and completing homework, and be more responsible in general. And like so many of us, the basic assumption being made here is that if students aren't being responsible, which covers a wide variety of skills and dispositions, then they should feel the consequences. Rewards and punishments are typically what happen. That is, we tend to should students. You should be responsible. You should cooperate. And the finger comes out, and often along with the phrase, from now on. As soon as that finger comes out, you've kind of shot them. And it's really hard to ask the questions, especially if you want to have good questions later. Using rewards and punishment short circuits the learning process, and it makes it really difficult when that finger comes out to find out the answers and the questions we really want our students to engage with. Students often really want to participate, and some people might say they always want to participate. Students usually don't wake up in the morning and say, boy, I want to go into school today and really be terrible. They usually want to participate, but the reason what leads them not to be able to participate is often that they just don't have the skills to actually do so. They don't have the skills to actually accomplish what they want to do, and sometimes they don't even have the awareness that a skill is needed. So this awareness that these skills are kind of important has been an important part of educational reform processes for a long, long time. It was actually the major starting point of the critical skills program itself. And back in the early 1980s, really at the instigation of Peter Eppig, he gathered college academics and business leaders from really big corporations like Digital and DEC and all of those types of corporations, pre-college educators, parents, and they all asked the same thing. What do we want our students to be able to do and to be like in school and outside of school? As then, if you ask any bunch of educators or business leaders or parents or teachers the same question, you get a very similar list of skills and dispositions. The words are slightly different, but it's always easy to cross-map the lists to each other and show that they're really talking about the same thing. With the advent of what has been called brain-based learning, sometimes the term executive functioning skills has risen to the top of the discussion, because there's an awareness that our prefrontal cortex is responsible for helping us do a lot of these things that we have labeled critical skills. I'm not so excited about the term soft skills, though you often hear it, because it makes it seem like they're less important or of less value than the so-called hard skills. But to me, they're exactly the things that make learning possible. So back in the era between 1981 and 85, they started off with a list of 12 critical skills, and you can see those if you look at some of the original coaching kits. About 10 years later, they were sorted and reorganized into a list of 8 critical skills and 7 fundamental dispositions. But again, added a little bit, reorganized, but it's really the basic same ideas, that these are the things that we really want students to be able to do and to be like in our classrooms and outside of classrooms. An important point to stress here is that part of this resorting actually raised to the top the realization that essential knowledge is kind of like a third leg of the triangle, that it's really important to focus on content as well as these critical skills and dispositions. They all help each other, and they're all done in parallel. An interesting point about differentiating. When I teach critical skills institutes, I find that K through 8 teachers are all into teaching critical skills and dispositions. They get the importance of doing those things. High school teachers, on the other hand, they're all about the content, and they're perhaps less interested in doing critical skills and dispositions. They don't always necessarily see the importance. So the challenge is to kind of convince the K through 8 teachers, yes, keep on doing those critical skills and dispositions, but do them at the same time you're doing your math or whatever the content is you're afterwards. And with the high school teachers, you say, yeah, keep on doing your topic, but at the same time, do these other things, these critical skills and dispositions, and guess what? It'll make teaching your content way easier. So the point is to make things all happen at the same time. The learning will be richer, more complete, and deeper. At about the same time that resorting of the critical skills and dispositions happened, there was an awareness that it was worthwhile talking about what are called the 4 pillars of powerful learning, which in this case have to do with collaborative learning communities, standard-based learning, experiential learning, and problem-based learning. They all hold up the learning enterprise. I actually think of it a little bit different. As Tom mentioned, I used to be, I'm not anymore, but I used to be for 30 years a volunteer firefighter, excuse me. And one of the things you learn when you're in firefighting school is that there are 4 things that you need in order to support combustion. you need fuel, you need heat, you need oxygen, and you need a chemical chain reaction to keep the combustion going. And if you remove any one of those four things, the fire kind of goes out. Well, it struck me that these four pillars are really of the same type. And I kind of made this little model here to help me think about it. So one piece of the puzzle is problem-based learning. And Natalie Stotts talked eloquently about the value of really designing authentic, challenge, problem-based activities. Another piece is experiential learning, which is used to kind of combine everything all together and to make the whole learning enterprise purposeful and with a real direction. Another thing is that you have standards that actually drive what it is that you're doing, which are both content standards, but also these critical skills and dispositions. And at the base of everything is the wonderful collaborative learning community that Danica Tomisky talked about on the first one of these sessions that really supports the whole enterprise. So you put them all together, you make this wonderful tetrahedron. If you remove any one of them, in some sense, the whole thing goes out. Now, we all know that there are lots of very excellent classrooms that don't have all four of these pieces, but I claim that it will always be richer if you include all four of these things. Incidentally, the explicit identification of these four pillars, especially the experiential learning cycle, was why the name of the program was kind of changed to Education by Design for a while. Needless to say, I was actually really pleased when the name went back to the Critical Skills Program, because in many ways, I think that's really the guts of what makes our program so special. So one of the major insights of the classroom model was the identification of a process that can help develop the critical skills in a truly educative manner. Thinking back to my cooperation anecdote that I started with, it was clear that the students had heard that word many, many times, but had not been given the opportunity to articulate what the word meant in practice. So how do you do it? Well, I'm going to show you a short video clip of one of my physics classes from a few years ago. We were exploring how to use the ideas of gravitation and orbits in order to determine the masses of stars, planets, the Milky Way, and the universe itself using real astronomical data. So it was a very authentic based activity because I was actually asking them to imagine that they were actual astronomers. Again, Natalie talked about the value of having a little bit of whimsy. So I almost always couch things in terms of the scenario to make it a little bit more fun and engaging. This was a pretty motivated group. About mid-year, well, actually mid-semester, we're a semester school. So we'd already developed standard operating procedures and had practice doing challenges. But as you will hear, they had things yet to learn that would be valuable. The clip will illustrate framing, which refers to the practice of surrounding an activity at the start and then coming back to it at the end with important guidelines and explanations. A tremendous way to help students start to understand a skill or disposition, in this case, ownership, is to frame the activity with the behaviors associated with the targeted skill. So this little vignette shows how it happened a while ago. Whoops, let's go back. Sorry. We're going to follow our operating procedures, but I actually want to start off before I set you loose to kind of talk a little bit about a particular skill that I think would really be valuable for us to focus on a little bit during these next 3 days. And that skill is the idea of ownership, taking responsibility for your own learning. And what I'd like to do, because I'm not convinced completely that we've done super jobs with that so far yet. I mean, we've done really nice work in lots of different things, but I still get a sense that you're really relying a lot, particularly on me, instead of on each other and on yourself. And I'd really like to kind of address what that really looks like when you actually take responsibility for your own learning. So to do that, if everybody, you won't need to bring anything with you right now, but conceivably you might want your notebook and something to write with. So if everybody could grab your notebook and something to write with, and probably the challenge sheet too, just stick that in there. And if you could all stand up and bring your chairs and make a semi-circle. So here's what we'd like to do, just to generate a list of what this actually will look like. I like to think of it as, suppose you were a fly on the wall and you were watching what was happening in the room. Or maybe you're not a fly, but just a person, a real person that comes and stands at the doorway and looks into the room. And what we're looking for is evidence that would lead that person to say, those people in that room are taking ownership of their own learning. Just by looking. So what would they see? What might they actually hear? So this was how we actually generated our list of behaviors, and then we came back at the end and talked about that list and asked how well did we do? Did we see those things happening? Did we notice evidence of our ownership? And we'll talk about that later when we get to a further slide. Another way to do the same thing is called embedding. And embedding actually means that you insert language into the activity that you're asking the students to do that actually requires them to demonstrate the particular skill or disposition that you're after. Now, you can do almost any particular one of the critical skills in a particular challenge. Now, in this case, I'll just show a quick little example. Suppose you were trying to target problem solving and organization. Indicators of that are considering more than one idea and rationing time efficiently. I'm going to focus on problem solving first, because what I would do typically with students, if problem solving was a thing that I wanted to really help develop, in particular this idea of coming up with lots of ideas, I would hook them a little bit in advance with a brainstorming activity. And this is one that I use a lot. This drawing was by Al Magnuson, just to give him a little credit. The question is, how do you get the hippo out of the tub? And we would do a brainstorming activity in order to get the students to come up with as many ideas as they could in a very short amount of time about getting the hippo out of the tub. They have a lot of fun doing that. It's fast, it's funny, it's furious. And it's really important that you make it happen fast, funny, and furious, or else it's just people sitting around coming with ideas instead of brainstorming. But then after we brainstorm, they have that skill. We put that in our toolbox, and then we actually ask them to do that in the middle of the challenge. So this particular activity is based upon the voyage of the Mimi, involved looking at particular species of whales and coming up with a couple of answers to various questions that involve its physiology and the environment that it lives in. But at the same time that you're doing that content, you throw in this language that says, make sure that during your presentations, you share with us different ideas you had for your bulletin board. That's the thing about problem solving that you conceivably might want to emphasize, coming up with lots of different ideas. And also, to focus on the organization aspect, you require the students to turn in a project planning sheet to show that they've actually set up a schedule for the week. Now, for the activity that you saw my students working on, I was looking at ownership, taking responsibility for the process and outcomes of learning. And in yellow, you can see the language that I stuck in there to get them to do that. If they have high quality alternatives to suggest, let me know. And they did actually come up with several alternatives. They decided to tweak the way the presentation happened. So they did take ownership of what was going on. Now, during a challenge like this, they have many opportunities to show lots of different skills. I mean, the richness of problem-based learning is that all of these critical skills and dispositions will probably show up at one time or another. And here you can see them organizing themselves and then sharing responsibilities, dividing up the tasks and collaborating. Here you can see that, again, they're checking base and making sure that they're staying on track. working together in order to communicate among themselves and using hints and suggestions from each other. And then finally presenting, showing good communication skills. Again, another example of the presentation. So at the end, after all of that had happened, they debriefed. I'd really love it if you guys were debriefing yourself. Somebody like to run it? Thank you, Katie.
Oh, wow. All right, Katie. Assessed.
All right, guys, fellas, scientists, do we do okay?
Teamwork.
Katie. You're welcome.
Strategy.
No,
Yes.
you keep
So
the
just
room.
really quickly, but they continued the debriefing. They ended up actually looking at the list of indicators that we had developed and asked whether we had done this or not. Notice that they actually recognized the value of using the sweep tool as a way of getting everybody to involve. So they did great work as they presented their work to an outside audience, because there were a couple other people beside myself there, and along the way they demonstrated important evidence of ownership. So that's why I think they're pretty important. It's why I think the Critical Skills program has some really keen insights into how to do this. And I'd like to just end with a final story. This was from another class, a few years after the class that you observed, a very different bunch of students. Not quite as skilled. They had a lot of not great history with each other when they came into the classroom. They had a great deal of difficulty taking ownership, collaborating, just all of these things that we kind of hope our students will have. But it was a great problem-solving activity for me, though I will admit that if I had been a novice teacher, I probably would have quit because they were very, very tricky. And so as a result, I ended up working pretty diligently with them, asking them how to make things better, working with them all along. Their favorite conversation, incidentally, was asking themselves, telling each other the stories of how they got their middle school teacher to quit before the end of the year. But at the end of the year, one of the students came up to me and said, you know, Mr. Vinton, I know we weren't always the easiest class to work with, but I really, really appreciate all the work that you guys did with us. And I think we actually ended up learning something, and I know we learned how to become better at working with each other. So I'd like to thank you for that. So sometimes you just never know what it is that you end up getting. So that's the kind of end of where I am right now. So I think I'm going to hand it back to Tom and Laura and open up the discussion.
Wow, thank you so much, Bill. I've heard you talk about critical skills for years because I've worked with you for a long time. But I always, like Tom said, I always learn something new every time that you talk about your experience and your students. So if you have questions for Bill, drop them into the question and answer tool or drop them into the chat. At this point, it's fine to put them either place. So Tom, do you have a question to start us off?
Thank you, Bill, so much. As you were talking, you were making me think about the experiential learning cycle that I know we've mentioned in a couple of these other webcasts. And I think you gave us some really good examples of how there it is, thanks. In the teacher cycle there, you gave us some really good examples of how the teacher designs into a challenge opportunities for the students to practice those critical skills and dispositions. And you showed us examples of students being engaged with those. And I think that and then I was thinking about this coaching phase for teachers, and I think that the way in which you use the looks like, sounds like T-chart was in a sense a kind of coaching because you were helping make evident for them what ownership looks like and sounds like. so that they would have a better idea of what you were looking for. And I'm wondering, is there anything else that you can point to or think of that you would say were sort of coaching moves that you might have used in that or another challenge that you found really effective in terms of helping to foster critical skills during a challenge?
Yeah, well, first of all, just like to point out that the full versions, the longest one is 7 minutes, I think, of the videos of what happened during the challenge are actually on the resource sheet that Laura is going to distribute. So you can kind of see some examples. But, you know, one of the things I would do is that, you know, after a half a class or so, when they had been working on stuff, I might call a quick little timeout and I might ask, hey folks, let's just go over and look at our list, our T-chart here and see, have we seen any of these things going on? And I would ask them to kind of just mention a couple of examples and we'd go down through the list and say, we've seen this, we've seen this, we've seen this, just to make sure that they really recognize that these things were really going on. Most of the actual coaching that I did kind of ongoing mostly had to do with the content. You know, I'm a big dropper of stickies. So I would throw little hints to them every now and then by putting a sticky next to them if I could see, because these ideas that we were talking about were not easy. And it's really easy, particularly if you're a novice learner, to get kind of off track pretty easily. So I would occasionally throw a sticky in, and again, the video, you'll see some examples of me. I think I dropped 3x5 cards instead of stickies on this one. They'd end up taking the hint and say, oh yeah, that's right. So I forgot about that. So we would do a lot of that. And at the end of every day, we had built into our standard procedures the idea that what we would do is at the end of every day, we would talk about our progress. And it was mostly student run discussion about where they were and what they'd actually accomplished and what they needed to do. But I would regularly go back to the T-chart and just point out some of the things that they had done or ask them if they had seen some of the things that were listed there.
So we have a question. Natalie actually has a question. She said, could you talk a little about teaching and coaching students to take ownership of the debriefing process, and more specifically, how to teach them to effectively debrief?
Yep. Well, mostly right at the the very first thing, I mean, there's a process of scaffolding. The very first challenge, I run it like from beginning to end, and I'm the facilitator, but I tell them, you might want to watch pretty carefully what I'm doing because I'm going to be asking you to do this later on. And so by the time that we got to the point in the year where this class was, they had had several experiences where I had successively pulled myself back more and more. I think the important thing about setting up a debriefing session that the students can run is have a couple of structures that they can use. And I tend to use an okay next time structure because it's pretty easy to understand. They can see what's going on. They understand it kind of implicitly. And that's what actually the girl by the name of Katie was actually running an okay next time debriefing. Later on, we might get into a what, so what, now what format. Those tend to be what I focus on just because they're simple and easy to think about. I know.
And by okay next time, you mean what did we do that was okay, and what would we do differently next time?
Perfect. Yes, exactly. Yep. I know Nelia Rath has a lot of tools that she uses for debriefing that might be nice things to use that I haven't used just because I just haven't. But I'll also, let's see. Oh, here we go. The TP3 is actually kind of a nice coaching tool as well that helps the students figure out the things that are important in terms of framing an activity and figuring out what they need to do, but also for the debriefing later on. That there's these 4 parts to anything that you have to do. And this actually really works well if you're writing a paper too. But you ask, what are the separate chunks? What's the purpose? What's the product? And the thing that they always don't get really well is this process part down here, which is where you target the skill or disposition. mean, even adults that you lead through, they just don't quite get that without a lot of practice. But all of these quadrants become fair game for our debriefing at the end. And it's really useful. I will often pull this out on a piece of paper and stick it up and say, all right, let's just talk about these things. Use this as the source of your okays and your next times.
So, Bill, in using this TP3, would you require, let's say students are working in small groups in a challenge, would you require them to hand this, to fill this out in their group and then hand it back to you? Or use it just for themselves? Or how, can you talk more about this particular tool as a coaching method?
Almost always everything is whole group challenges that they divide themselves up later on. So for me, the primary use of the TP3 is when the whole group is trying to articulate what the nature of the overall problem and challenge is. And it really, really helps. I mean, one of my little bumper stickers, if you don't see it, it's forgotten. So putting this up on the wall so that everybody keeps on remembering what it is that everybody needs to do. Part of the task is typically to divide up into the smaller task groups that they figure out for themselves often. Depends on the group. Sometimes I'll split them up into the groups depending upon what the culture of the class is like. But nevertheless, this is, for me, mostly a large group thing, though I have occasionally see small groups pull this out and actually start doing it for themselves too, to start figuring out their individual tasks.
I think I was thinking partly, you're right now talking about working with high school students.
Yep.
I was thinking about how for my early elementary students, I would obviously adapt this so that it was appropriate for a younger age group. But then sometimes I would say, okay, now as a kind of coaching move, I would say, before you get started on your work, you have to come to me, you have to meet with me, and we're going to go through this so that I can make sure I understand what it is that you're going to be doing. And that gave me an opportunity to then kind of ask and coach them questions and move them along.
Something I learned from Al Magnuson, he said that sometimes when kids are working on something and they get stuck, you take them over to your poster that we call the toolbox and says, all right, we're stuck here, and what kind of problem are we having and what kind of tool might help us get out of this hole? And the TP3, of course, is an important thing in the toolbox, and it's really good. I mean, you mentioned younger students, and I can remember seeing a video of Betsy O'Leary's second grade class that was debriefing itself. And I'll tell you, it almost brought tears to my eyes watching those second graders debriefing themselves, because I so wanted my own daughters to be in that classroom, to have that kind of sense of responsibility and the ability to kind of reflect on their own work. Also, I ended up visiting Bonnie Irwin's class once, fourth grade class, and they were debriefing the previous day. They'd had a substitute teacher, and apparently that hadn't gone so well. And so they debriefed themselves, and they really did a very honest, reflective job of identifying the fact that they had not done a really good job with their substitute teacher, and they developed a plan right on the spot. And Bonnie was in the back of the room watching them do this, and again, I was watching them and say, man, I'd just love to have my daughters in this classroom.
Right.
Yeah.
So, Bill, so I have a comment from one of the participants, and then I have a question of my own. So the comment was that one of the things that always struck me about critical skills is the level of explicit scaffolding and instruction. I think so often adults just assume kids are going to get what you're showing them. And this pulls back the curtain and makes it more clear in a good way. And I don't know if you want to respond to that comment at all.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I think that's the absolute crucial piece of this, is the scaffolding that you do to kind of get students ready, and that you really lead them. And you don't just kind of say, be responsible. You kind of show them what it means in practice. I know that back when I did my first Critical Skills Institute, taught by Bruce Bonney and Michael Leary, at that time, they actually had what they called backstage. And it was a separate classroom. And in that classroom, they had plastered the walls with every single thing that they had thought about in order to design and to scaffold and to arrange the institute. And I'm standing there in the middle of this room, and I'm looking around and I'm saying to myself, oh my gosh, I can't ever do all this kind of planning. But the amazing thing is you really can. It kind of happens at first. I mean, one of the things I want to say is that, you know, after my first Critical Skills Institute, and I went back to my own classroom and started doing this, I completely forgot about framing and embedding critical skills. And we really didn't talk a lot about critical skills, except have the poster on the wall and say, these are important things. But my kids did lots of challenges. And the cool thing about a problem-based challenge is that these things pop up by themselves naturally. So they demonstrated a lot of good things. We debriefed them at the end. So they ended up learning about all of these things. But there's a real value to being intentional at the beginning and targeting it. But I guess I didn't ruin the kids. And so they ended up having a great year, and I had a great year, and I'm still here. So they ended up learning a lot of things. So it was great. Yep.
So I guess my question then is, you know, if I were somebody, like if this webcast were my first exposure to critical skills, and I wasn't going to get into an institute or into the immersion class anytime soon, but I wanted to start somewhere with this specific idea of targeting a specific skill or disposition. And my kids hadn't done anything like this before. They were sort of used to a fairly traditional classroom structure. What would you tell me to do first?
You want to take us back to that critical skills and disposition slide,
Yeah.
Bill, so we can look at those while
Yeah.
you think about that? Yeah.
So, I mean, the first thing I would say, take a Critical Skills Institute. I mean, that it really takes that amount of to really make this all kind of make sense. I think it's worthwhile reading Tony Wagner's book, The Global Achievement Gap, because he kind of lays out, I mean, it's really the book that this program should have written to kind of explain why it exists. But as so many programs do, I mean, so many books and thinkers do, they come up with all these ideas, but they don't know how to do it. And I think that's the unique value of the Critical Skills program, is that it kind of really makes it explicit how to do it. So what to start with? I mean, the things that I always begin with: problem solving, working on brainstorming skills, coming up with lots of ideas is a really important thing. And with the HIPPO activity, it's kind of fun and it's interesting. So you get them kind of used to thinking about how to come up with lots of ideas, because that's often something people will say is, I don't have any ideas. And I say, well, have you done any brainstorming yet? And the answer will be, oh, yeah, this bit. Okay. Okay. I also focus on collaboration a lot. Notice that cooperation is not actually listed here in our new list, because it's really subsumed by lots of other things. It's actually kind of a rather low-level skill that's kind of divided among lots of different things. But collaboration is really about how students think of themselves as members of a team. And I spend a lot of time working on that. And perhaps that may be the only two ones I really work at. We do work on communication. We organize presentations and think about how that goes. But to start off with, if they haven't had a lot of experience, those are two things to really begin with.
Which two? Problem solving and collaboration?
Yeah. And, and every now and then what else comes up depends upon the culture of the classroom. I mean, sometimes you'll have students that really need to work on their sense of curiosity, so I'll focus on that. The trick is to not target too many, because if you target too many, you don't hit any. So really target a few until you're sure they really get it, and only then go on to another one.
Yeah, I always tell my students when I taught the instructional design class, or in my facilitation class, really any of my classes where we touch on this specific work, which is all of my classes, I guess, now that I think about it. I always tell them to start with one, because even though it seems like you want to do them all, or you want to do 3, as a beginner, start with one, because it's hard to keep your eye on just that one thing, and it's good practice to
Yep.
really carefully teach and assess just one.
Yeah.
And they always say, well, no, I'm going to do 2 because I know that these 2 are going to be in there and it'll be easy. And then they come back after, and in the debrief, they say, yeah, I should have done 1.
Yeah. I mean, again, you target one.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're working on a challenge, all of these things will show up.
Exactly.
And then if something important happens with respect to all those other ones, you talk about it and you kind of link it to the word and say, well, you know, when you did this, this really showed that you had good organization. Okay, so that you don't kind of let them fall on the floor and never get talked about. But to start off with, just focus on 1 and maybe 2. Yeah.
So Bill, that raises a question in my mind. Do you grade critical skills?
So here's, boy, what a big question. That's another. The assessment and grading thing is another thing.
Well, we'll get you back. You could give us the quick answer, and then we'll get
here's
back.
here's the quick answer. So when I assign grades to these things, I basically grade the product in terms of the quality of the product as a product that stands by itself as a form of communication. And then for the level of the ideas, the essential knowledge that it correctly shows. Now, the other stuff, like the critical thinking, the critical skills, we actually have a separate category in our gradebook that's called daily performance. And that's kind of where that gets lumped. I will give them pretty good written feedback after each one of their challenges, individual feedback, so that they will know how they did on their problem solving and their curiosity or whatever the targeted ones were. But I'm mostly after whether they really engaged in trying to make those 2 skills and dispositions actually work. So it's mostly narrative feedback with respect to those.
And I know that in a lot of elementary report cards now, we'll have kind of the essential academic skills on one side, and then we'll actually have critical skills, of a kind on another, and we'll have a kind of, as opposed to a grade, may have a rating.
Yeah.
That has the student demonstrated this?
And I am so trying hard to get our high school to do something like that. Because
well, more and more high schools and states are going to competency-based instruction or proficiency-based instruction or something like that. And the competencies typically include things like the skills or dispositions or skills.
Absolutely. Yep.
And so there are a lot of teachers right now that I talk to in my work at Antioch who are, they've been tasked with grading their students' communication and collaboration and organization skills. And it either becomes just a checkbox, like, of course, I'm not gonna keep somebody from graduating because of that. And other folks who just really struggle with making it a meaningful, authentic assessment. And what I think it always comes back to is that we can't assess something that we don't teach.
Yeah.
And as you said at the beginning, there are lots of times that we just expect kids to know this stuff. And then we get mad at them because they don't, but nobody's actually ever taken the time to, exactly. Nobody's ever taught them how to do that in practice. It's all been just sort of theoretical, and a whole lot of why don't you?
Yeah.
Which isn't real helpful.
From now on, right?
Yeah, well, it's really shame focused, and we know about the way brains respond to shame, and when you make somebody feel bad because they don't know how to be organized or they don't know how to communicate, it doesn't really set them up to want to learn how to do it. They just sort of get in that fixed mindset of, well, I'm just not organized. I'm just not a good communicator.
So the lifesaver that's happened for me recently is I've finally stumbled on what I think is the way that I've always tried to figure out how to actually take good records of what happens while kids are working. because I've tried lots of different things, but the thing I found that works the best right now is I've made a simple Google form with 2 questions, basically the name of the student and what I see. And so I type in this student's name, I type what I see, which might be a quote or something that I happen. I don't worry about sorting them into particular skills. I just say what it is that I see because I know it's important. Then I hit enter, and then it opens up the next one. And then what you end up with is a wonderful timestamp list, and you can sort them by name, and you have this ongoing record. And then you can go say, well, this is critical thinking, this was creative thinking, this, you know, so you can sort all these little observations, and it's just solve my problem of how to take records during one of these things.
Yeah. It reminds me of the olden days when we used to have a file folder with the sticky
gosh,
notes
yeah.
sort of fanned out. You'd have to tape them because the sticky notes would lose their sticky.
Yep.
Well, that sounds like, Laura, it sounds like next time we'll have to have Bill come back and demonstrate that for us.
Yeah, we're going to have to do a whole nother series of these because we've got all kinds of things that we need to do. So it's about that time. Bill, do you have a final thing any final words before we move into our closing stuff?
No, I don't. I think we kind of said it, except that don't forget the importance of including the critical skills and dispositions in your classroom. And as the comment said, it's all about careful scaffolding of these skills so that students know what they look like and act like to actually demonstrate these skills. Translating them into particular behaviors is the crucial thing, as long as you connect the behavior to the big word. And that's the thing that often doesn't happen.
That's wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Yep.
So I just dropped in the chat the link to the website, to a Google Doc that has all of the resources that Bill referenced. The level 1, or what was called, now it's just called the coaching kit, which includes the TP3 and some other materials and a lot of explanation. There are also links there to the full-length videos. And if you go to the evaluation link that's on that page, after you do the evaluation, you'll get to a certificate that you can download if you need professional development evidence for your participation today. We'll also be sending out an email with this information and the link to the YouTube upload of this particular event. Next time, we will be talking to Rachel Van Hazinga, who is from Deal School in Deal, New Jersey. She is a K-8 teacher who is a STEAM teacher. So all of her work is in a STEAM classroom. And she'll be talking about the ways that critical skills supports her work as a STEAM teacher and the way that STEAM principles and practices can help support critical skills teachers. So even if you're not a STEAM teacher, there'll still be some great stuff to learn. And as always, we'll use the same structure, so we'll have some great question and answer and discussion. There are also some links that you'll see on that resources page to get in touch with Tom and I if you have any questions or need anything. And you can also follow us all over the place on social media, and those links are on that page as well. I am Critical Skills 1, and we're Antioch, New England, some version of Antioch New, all across all the different social media platforms as well.
There's also links to me and some information that I put there as well, kind of random things that I found interesting.
Wonderful. Yep. Wonderful. That is perfect. Thank you very much, Bill. So Tom, any closing words?
Not just to say we look forward to seeing everybody in 2 weeks. And Bill, thank you very much. We'll look forward to having you join us again sometime.
You bet.
Great.
All right.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye. Have a great night.